Vijay, so the first question that I have for you is a burning question that's on everyone's mind. What is a tankie?
Oh, well, I see. What is a tankie? It's great to be with you. This is one of my favorite podcasts. It's not a tanky podcast. I don't even know really why we would play with the term. The term has a funny origin, and I actually hadn't heard this term in many, many years. It made a return just a few years ago, I think, when a certain section of particularly in the West, a certain section of social media opinion started to attack people who seemed to be in favor of the Cuban Revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela, people who were with Evo Morales at the time when the coup was happening. People like that, that is to say, people like you and I, began to be called tankies. This is a term that comes from 1956, certainly before you were born, and yes, even before I was born. That's when Soviet tanks entered Hungary. And the question lay before the international left in 1956: do you support the Soviet intervention or not? Those who supported the Soviet intervention were disparagingly called tankies. Now, if you know anything about 1956 and if you know anything about Hungary, you might want to reconsider not supporting the Soviet intervention, because that was one of the most fascistic countries, perhaps had a society more fascistic than Nazi Germany. And so, the whatever socialist project was at work in Hungary in 1956 was being threatened not by liberalism or democracy, but by fascism. It's a very different situation in 1968 when Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia. Then it was a question of reform, more liberal reform. It was not fascism. But 1956, pretty straightforward situation. That term, tanky, those who support the Soviet tanks entering Hungary, was resurrected, it seems to me, just in the last few years. And it's a creature of social media. I mean, I have never in my life actually been called a tanky to my face. But I do regularly get called tanky, especially on Twitter. This is more a Twitter phenomena, where people have all kinds of pseudonyms, and half the people who seem to call me tanky have accounts that, to my mind, seem like CIA bot accounts. But how am I supposed to know? I haven't read the internal documents from Twitter. I have seen the leaked document from Facebook, which confirms that there's an enormous number of Miami based troll armies that have been managing accounts regarding Honduras, Cuba, Venezuela, and so on. Yes, we know they're on Facebook. They must be on Twitter, and they're the ones who call you a tanky.
Well, I also find it just fascinating because it came out in a time when the fact is that the people with the tanks and the guns were actually supporting the coup, and those who didn't have the tanks and didn't have the guns were against a coup, specifically against Evo Morales. But in other places, like the Honduran elections are underway as we talk right now, and we know that the United States backed a military coup there. We know that the United States has backed several coup attempts in places like Venezuela. I mean, you wrote a book about this. And so in reality, when they're saying tanky, I would just find it funny because it's like, who has the tanks and who has the bullets? It's definitely not the people who are struggling for, social democracy or struggling for socialism. It's definitely the people in the imperialist core who are, repeating CIA talking points, who those talking points aren't innocent, but they are often betrust by the barrel of a tank gun or the barrel of a gun itself. And so I always just find that really fascinating. It's the people with no power, so to speak, in terms of military force who are being being relabeled. It's the colonial turn. It's like all of a sudden self-defense looks like violence or becomes aggression, and then invasion itself or colonialism becomes a form of self-defense. So I always find that like a very bizarre term, but it does have this historical origin, which I think is important.